Hello everyone, welcome back. I know many of you use these videos to unwind or fall asleep. So before you get too cozy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's get started. I never thought inheriting my uncle's old farmhouse would lead me to question reality itself. It all started when I received a letter from a lawyer stating that my Uncle Jack had passed away and left me his property in the countryside. I hadn't seen him since I was a kid, and my memories of him were vague, just flashes of a tall man with a stern face who rarely smiled. Curiosity and a need for a fresh start drove me to pack up my life in the city and head out to the farmhouse. The drive took me through winding roads lined with towering oak trees whose branches stretched out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the house, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. The farmhouse stood isolated on a vast expanse of land, its paint peeling and windows clouded with dust. I parked my car and stepped out, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else I couldn't quite place. Musty, like old books left in a cellar. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with antique furniture covered in white sheets. I pulled one of the sheets off, coughing as a cloud of dust enveloped me. Underneath was a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age. "Well, home sweet home," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning, unpacking, and exploring the house. There were rooms upon rooms, some locked, others filled with relics from a bygone era. Old photographs, tarnished silverware, and stacks of letters tied with frayed ribbons. One evening, while rummaging through the attic, I found a diary belonging to my uncle. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing farm work and weather patterns. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. He wrote about hearing whispers in the night, seeing shadows that didn't belong, and feeling a constant presence watching him. "They won't leave me alone," one entry read. "The watchers in the woods grow closer each night." I brushed it off as the ramblings of a lonely old man. That night, however, I heard it. A faint sound of whispering coming from the woods that bordered the property. I stood on the porch, straining my ears. The whispers were unintelligible, like a chorus of voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. Shaking my head, I went back inside, convincing myself it was just the wind rustling through the trees. The next morning, I decided to explore the woods. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was cooler here, and the silence was profound. No birds chirping, no rustling of small animals, just an eerie quiet. About half a mile in, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a stone well, ancient and covered in moss. Curiosity piqued, I approached it. Peering over the edge, I saw nothing but darkness. I dropped a small pebble and waited for the sound of it hitting the bottom, but there was nothing. No splash, no echo. A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I hurried back to the farmhouse, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That night, the whispering returned, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from just outside my bedroom window. Gathering my courage, I pulled back the curtain. Under the pale moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its eyes, or where eyes should be, glowed faintly. I stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Sleep eluded me, and when dawn finally broke, I questioned whether I'd imagined the whole thing. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I headed into town to ask about the property's history. At the local diner, I struck up a conversation with an elderly man named Tom. "Ah, you're Jack's nephew," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Surprised someone from the family finally showed up." "What do you mean?" I asked. He sighed. "That land's got a dark past. Folks around here steer clear of it." He went on to tell me about strange occurrences dating back decades, people disappearing in the woods, sightings of ominous figures, and a well that's said to be a gateway to something not of this world. "Old wives' tales," I scoffed, trying to mask my unease. Tom leaned in closer. "Believe what you want, but if I were you, I'd leave that place and never look back." I returned home, his words echoing in my mind. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the house changed. The air grew heavy, and an oppressive silence settled in. Then came the scratching, a faint, intermittent sound coming from the walls. I followed it, pressing my ear against the old wood paneling. It moved, scurrying from one end of the house to the other. Rats, I thought, though deep down I knew it was something else. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and made my way to the electrical panel in the basement. The steps creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder as I descended. Reaching the bottom, I swept the flashlight around. The beam caught a mass of old furniture and boxes. I approached the electrical panel and opened it. Everything seemed in order. As I flipped the main switch, the lights came back on. Relieved, I turned to head back upstairs, but something caught my eye. A door I'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind a large cabinet. It was made of heavy iron and had strange symbols etched into its surface. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I moved the cabinet aside and grasped the cold handle. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow passage leading further underground. "Probably just a root cellar," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I stepped inside, the walls closing in around me. The passage ended at another door, this one wooden and rotting. Pushing it open, I entered a circular chamber lit by candles that shouldn't have been burning. In the center of the room was a stone altar covered in dark stains. My heart raced as I realized the stains were dried blood. Symbols similar to those on the iron door adorned the walls, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of old blood and something sulfuric. A low hum filled the room, growing louder by the second. The walls seemed to pulse, and shadows moved independently of any light source. Panic surged through me. I turned to flee but found the doorway gone, replaced by solid stone. The humming grew louder, turning into a cacophony of whispers, the same whispers I'd heard from the woods. "Join us," the voices beckoned. "No," I screamed, banging on the wall where the door had been. A figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched too wide. It was Uncle Jack. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped. "But now that you have, there's no turning back." I backed away, my mind reeling. "You're dead." He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed unnaturally. "Dead? No. I've transcended." The shadows in the room began to take form, twisted, nightmarish creatures with elongated limbs and faces devoid of features. I closed my eyes, willing it all to be a nightmare. When I opened them, Uncle Jack stood inches from me, his breath cold against my skin. "They've chosen you," he whispered. "The Watchers have waited long for a new guardian." "Guardian of what?" I stammered. He pointed to the altar. "The gateway must be protected." Gathering every ounce of strength, I pushed past him, running blindly into the darkness. Suddenly the wall gave way, and I tumbled into the basement. Scrambling to my feet, I raced upstairs and out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I glanced back at the farmhouse. The windows glowed with an otherworldly light, and silhouettes of countless figures stood watching me. I sped away, the whispering voices fading as I put distance between myself and that accursed place. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the bed, hoping to find some solace in sleep. But peace wouldn't come. That night, I dreamt of the well in the woods, of being pulled into its endless darkness by unseen hands. I awoke drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in my mind. Determined to rid myself of this nightmare, I decided to destroy the well. At dawn, armed with gasoline and matches, I headed back to the farmhouse. The property was eerily silent as I made my way to the woods. Reaching the clearing, I found the well just as I'd left it. I poured gasoline around its base and down into the darkness. Striking a match, I hesitated for a moment before dropping it in. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a roar erupted from the well as flames shot up, illuminating the surrounding trees. The ground trembled and a deafening howl filled the air, a sound of rage and pain. I stumbled back, tripping over roots. The fire blazed higher, but instead of consuming the well, it seemed to be emanating from it. The shadows around me grew darker, and figures emerged from them, twisted beings like those in the underground chamber. They advanced toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, I turned and ran, branches whipping against my face as I tore through the forest. Bursting out of the woods, I headed straight for my car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The farmhouse was engulfed in flames, dark smoke billowing into the sky. But instead of feeling relief, a deep dread settled over me. I thought I'd escaped, but I was wrong. Over the next few days, no matter how far I traveled, the whispers followed. At night, shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and the figures haunted my dreams. Desperate, I sought out a renowned paranormal expert I'd found online, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Mills. Skeptical as I was, I had no other options. We met in a small cafe in a bustling city, far from the quiet terror of the farmhouse. "You're being pursued by entities from the other side," she said matter-of-factly after I recounted my story. "Can I stop them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She studied me for a moment. "There might be a way, but it won't be easy." Dr. Mills explained that I'd become a beacon for these entities by interacting with the well and the altar, gateways between worlds. To sever the connection, I needed to perform a ritual at the site where it all began. "Return there?" I shook my head. I barely made it out alive. "It's the only way," she insisted. "If you don't, they'll eventually pull you into their world." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We gathered the necessary items: protective charms, herbs, and a handwritten incantation. Together, we made the journey back to the farmhouse ruins. Night had fallen by the time we arrived. The land was scorched where the house once stood, and the well in the woods was nothing but a blackened hole. The atmosphere was heavy, each step we took laden with unseen resistance. We set up around the well, lighting candles and burning sage. Dr. Mills began chanting, her voice steady. I joined in, reading from the incantation she'd given me. As we progressed, the wind picked up, swirling leaves and ash around us. The whispers grew louder, now angry and piercing. "Don't stop," she shouted over the cacophony. The ground beneath us trembled, and the shadows coalesced into forms encircling us. One lunged at me, but bounced back upon hitting an invisible barrier formed by the ritual. Dr. Mills' chanting reached a crescendo. With a final shout, she threw a pouch of herbs into the well. A blinding light erupted from it, accompanied by a wail that sounded like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. Then, silence. The wind died down and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. The shadows dissipated, melting back into the darkness of the forest. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded, exhaustion evident on her face. "The connection is severed. They can't reach you now." Relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. We left the woods and I dropped her off at her hotel, thanking her profusely. She gave me a small talisman. "Keep this with you, just in case." I began to rebuild my life, moving to a new city and starting a new job. Months went by without incident. The nightmares ceased and the whispers were gone. One evening, as I walked home from work, I noticed a familiar figure across the street, a tall man with hollow eyes and a too-wide grin. Uncle Jack. I blinked and he was gone. My heart pounded. Had it all been for nothing? That night, as I lay in bed clutching the talisman, I heard it, a faint whisper from the darkest corner of the room. "We're still here." I sat up, every nerve ending on fire. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching toward me. Despair settled in. I realized then that some doors once opened can never truly be closed. I don't know how much time I have left before they come for me completely, but I had to share my story, to warn others. If you ever find yourself inheriting an old property with a dark history, leave it be. Some legacies aren't worth claiming. And if you hear whispers in the night, whatever you do, don't listen. Story 2. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, monsters, things that go bump in the night, they were all just stories to me. That was until I spent a weekend at my grandparents' old house in the countryside. They had passed away years ago, and the house had been sitting empty ever since. My parents wanted to sell it, but first someone needed to go through their belongings. Being the only one with a free weekend, I volunteered. The house was a 2-story Victorian-style building, with faded blue paint and a wraparound porch. It stood alone at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. As I pulled up the driveway, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, giving the place an eerie feel. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. Leaves crunched under my feet as I walked to the front door, the key heavy in my hand. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. "Hello?" I called out instinctively, even though I knew no one was there. The silence was thick. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. "Great," I mumbled. "No electricity." I made a mental note to check the fuse box later. Using the flashlight on my phone, I made my way through the house. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. Family photos lined the walls. Some I remembered from childhood visits, others I'd never seen before. I found the guest bedroom and set my bag down on the old iron bed. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, and the linens, though musty, were clean enough. I decided to start sorting through the attic while there was still some daylight. The attic door was a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. It resisted at first, but finally gave way with a sharp tug. A gust of stale air rushed down as the ladder unfolded. Climbing up, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. The attic was massive, filled with boxes, old furniture, and strange antiques. I started opening boxes at random: old clothes, vinyl records, tarnished silverware. Then I found a small wooden chest tucked behind an old trunk. It was locked, but the wood was soft with age. A little pressure and the lid snapped open. Inside was a collection of old journals and a peculiar-looking mirror. The mirror was small, framed in ornate silver with strange symbols etched into the metal. Its surface was tarnished, and when I wiped it with my sleeve, my reflection stared back, but something was off. My image seemed delayed, like a lag on a video call. A chill ran down my spine. I decided I'd had enough for the day and headed back downstairs. The sun was setting and the house grew darker. Remembering the fuse box, I made my way to the basement. The basement door was in the kitchen, hidden behind a large pantry. It creaked open to reveal steep wooden steps descending into darkness. Using my phone's flashlight again, I carefully made my way down. The basement was damp and cold. The stone walls glistened with moisture, and the air smelled of earth and mildew. I found the fuse box and flipped the main switch. The lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. As I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye, a doorway I hadn't noticed before, partially obscured by an old bookshelf. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved the shelf aside, revealing a heavy wooden door with an iron handle. I hesitated for a moment, but then opened the door. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair facing the wall. On the wall hung a large canvas covered with a white sheet. It looked like a painting. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Gripping the edge of the sheet, I pulled it down. The painting was a portrait of a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and piercing green eyes. But there was something unsettling about her gaze. It felt like she was looking right through me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. My phone's battery chose that moment to die, leaving me blind. I fumbled in my pocket for a lighter I knew I had. A small flame burst to life, casting a dim glow. In the faint light, I saw that the woman's eyes in the painting seemed to shine. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Help me," the voice said. I spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. "Help me." "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I backed out of the room and closed the door behind me. Racing up the stairs, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Back in the kitchen, the lights flickered back on. Shaken, I decided to make some tea to calm my nerves. As I waited for the water to boil, I glanced out the kitchen window. Under the pale moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods behind the house. It looked like the woman from the painting. I blinked, and she was gone. The kettle whistled, jolting me back to reality. I poured myself a cup and sat at the kitchen table, hands still shaking. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. Just then, footsteps echoed from the floor above me. Slow, deliberate steps crossing the length of the house. I grabbed a kitchen knife and mustered the courage to investigate. Climbing the stairs, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps led me to the master bedroom. The door was ajar. Pushing it open, I found the room empty. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting ghostly patterns on the floor. Then I saw it. The mirror from the attic, sitting on the dresser. I was sure I'd left it upstairs. As I approached, my reflection stared back, but again there was that delay. I waved my hand, and a second later, my reflection mimicked the motion. "What's wrong with this thing?" I muttered. Behind my reflection, I saw the woman standing in the doorway. I spun around, but the room was empty. Turning back to the mirror, she was closer now, standing right behind my reflected self. "Help me," she whispered. I felt a cold breath on my neck. Dropping the mirror, I ran out of the room. The glass shattered behind me, and with it, the lights went out again. I stumbled down the hallway, disoriented in the dark. The house seemed different, the corridors longer, twisting in ways they shouldn't. Doors appeared where there hadn't been any before. I opened one, hoping it was the guest room. Instead, it led back into the basement. How was that possible? A soft crying echoed from the dark room ahead. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. There in the corner sat the woman, her face buried in her hands. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "They trapped me here," she said. "Please, you have to help me." "Trapped you? Who did?" Before she could answer, heavy footsteps thundered above us, followed by a low, guttural growl. "He's coming," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "Hide." She vanished before my eyes. Panic surged through me. I looked for a place to hide, but the room was empty. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. A massive figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with a twisted smile and eyes that glowed like embers. "Welcome home," he said in a voice that rattled my bones. I backed away, hitting the wall. "What do you want?" He grinned wider. "It's not about what I want, it's about what you owe." "I don't owe you anything." He laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally. "Your family made a deal long ago. It's time to pay up." "What deal? I don't know anything about that." The room began to spin, darkness creeping in from the edges of my vision. The walls dissolved, and I found myself in a vast, empty void. The woman's voice echoed around me. "You have to break the curse." "How?" I shouted into the nothingness. "Destroy the mirror." "But I broke it already." "Not in your world," she replied. "In his." Suddenly I was back in the house, but everything was distorted, the walls crooked, the furniture floating, the air thick like syrup. The man stood before me, holding the mirror, now whole again. "You can't escape," he hissed. Desperate, I lunged at him, grabbing for the mirror. As my fingers touched it, a shock ran through me, and images flooded my mind. My grandparents standing before this man, sealing a deal for wealth in exchange for the soul of their first grandchild. "No," I gasped. "This can't be real." "Oh, but it is," he sneered. "And now it's time to fulfill the bargain." Rage and fear fueled me. "I won't let you take me." Using all my strength, I pulled the mirror from his grasp and threw it to the ground. It shattered into countless pieces, each shard reflecting a distorted version of his face. A deafening scream tore through the air as the man began to dissolve, his form breaking apart like dust in the wind. The house shook violently. Pieces of the ceiling fell around me. I had to get out. I raced toward the front door, dodging debris. Just as I reached it, the woman appeared one last time. "Thank you," she said softly. "Wait, who are you?" But she was gone. I burst outside as the house collapsed behind me, a cloud of dust and splintered wood filling the night sky. Breathing hard, I watched as the ground where the house stood smoothed over, leaving no trace it had ever been there. I got into my car and drove without looking back. Weeks later, I did some research on my family's history. I discovered that my grandparents had indeed come into sudden wealth around the time my parents were born. There were rumors in town about dark dealings, but nothing concrete. I tried telling my parents what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said the house had burned down years ago, that I must have gone to the wrong address. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Since that night, strange things have continued to happen. I see shadows out of the corner of my eye, hear whispers when I'm alone. I think the curse isn't broken after all. I'm sharing this story as a warning. Be careful what deals you make and always be wary of family secrets. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And if you ever come across an old mirror with strange symbols, leave it be. Because some reflections show more than just your image. They show your fate. Story 3. I never expected that a simple camping trip would turn into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. My friends and I had been planning it for months, Just a weekend getaway in the woods, away from the city, away from everything. It was supposed to be fun. You know, campfires, marshmallows, stargazing, but none of us could have predicted what really happened out there. There were 4 of us, me, Ryan, Sarah, and Mike. We'd been friends since high school and always tried to get together a couple of times a year. This time, Mike found this perfect spot deep in the national forest. It was supposed to be peaceful, far from any other campers. It took us almost 2 hours to hike from where we parked, through dense trees and rocky trails, to the spot he found. I remember thinking how secluded it was. Too secluded. We set up camp near a small clearing beside a stream. The place was beautiful during the day. Sunlight trickled through the trees, the sound of rushing water in the background. It felt like we had the entire world to ourselves. But by the time the sun started to set, things began to feel different. The forest, which had seemed so alive with sounds of birds and insects during the day, grew quiet, almost unnaturally quiet. That night, we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and told silly ghost stories. You know, the kind you tell just to spook each other a little. Ryan, of course, was the best at it. He had this way of building suspense with just his voice. But then it happened. We heard a noise coming from deep in the woods. It was faint at first, like branches snapping underfoot, but it was getting closer. Sarah laughed it off, saying it was probably just a deer or something. But Ryan frowned and stood up, looking in the direction of the sound. "That's not a deer," he said, his voice low. The footsteps stopped just beyond the tree line. We all stared into the darkness, our firelight not quite reaching that far. And then, from the shadows, we heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost too quiet to make out, but unmistakable. "Help me." My blood ran cold. The voice sounded like a woman's, but it was distorted, like it was coming through water. Mike immediately grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. "Who's there?" he called out. "Are you hurt?" Silence. He took a step toward the trees, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. Something in my gut told me that whatever was out there, we didn't want to get closer to it. But the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please." It sent shivers down my spine. Sarah was visibly shaken, clutching her jacket tightly around her. "We should leave," she said, her voice trembling. "We should go back." But Ryan, being the tough guy he always tried to be, insisted we check it out. "What if someone's actually out there, hurt or lost?" he reasoned. Reluctantly, Mike and Sarah agreed, though they didn't seem too thrilled about it. I didn't want to go, but I wasn't about to stay behind alone either. We grabbed our flashlights and slowly made our way toward the tree line. The beam of light from the flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of trees, but there was no sign of anyone. Still, that eerie feeling clung to me like a wet blanket. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but I didn't. We followed the sound deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal arms. And then we saw it. A figure, standing just ahead, partially hidden in the shadows. It was a woman, or at least, it looked like a woman. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung in dirty, tangled clumps around her face. She was standing perfectly still, her head slightly tilted down, staring at the ground. "Miss, are you okay?" Mike asked, stepping forward. She didn't answer. "Are you hurt?" Ryan tried again, edging closer. I stayed back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Something was wrong. The way she was standing, so rigid, so unnatural. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, she lifted her head, just enough for us to see her face. But it wasn't right. Her eyes. There were no eyes, just hollow, black voids where they should have been. Her mouth was twisted into a crooked, unnatural smile. And then, in that same distorted, watery voice, she whispered again. "Help me." We froze, none of us daring to move. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. She wasn't human. She couldn't be. Suddenly, she let out a low, guttural moan, and before we knew it, she started to move toward us. Not walking, gliding, as if her feet weren't touching the ground. Her head jerked unnaturally from side to side, her movements twitchy and frantic. "Run!" Ryan screamed. We bolted, tearing through the forest, branches slapping against our faces as we ran blindly in the dark. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could hear Sarah sobbing behind me, her breath ragged with fear. Mike was yelling something, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of our feet pounding the ground. We didn't stop running until we were back at the campsite, gasping for air. I turned back, expecting to see the woman chasing after us, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest. What the hell was that? Mike stammered, his face pale. I don't know, I panted. But we need to leave. Now. None of us argued. We hastily packed up what we could, barely bothering to extinguish the fire. The entire time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing watching us from the trees. We made our way back through the forest, moving as quickly as we could in the dark. The path seemed longer, the trees taller, as if the forest itself was trying to keep us there. But eventually we made it back to the car. It wasn't until we were speeding down the highway, the lights of the campsite far behind us, that any of us spoke again. Sarah was sobbing quietly in the back seat, while Ryan and Mike sat in stunned silence. What was that? Ryan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. We didn't talk about it much after that night. We tried to rationalize it, convince ourselves that it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Maybe we were all just tired, maybe it was some kind of weird optical illusion, maybe... I don't know, but deep down I knew the truth. There was something out there in those woods. Something old, something evil. To this day I can still hear that voice sometimes when I'm alone in the dead of night. Help. Me. And I know, whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. So if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, far from civilization, and you hear a voice calling for help, don't go looking for it. Some things are better left alone. Story 4. It all started on a Friday night. I had been working late, much later than usual. My boss needed some reports done before the weekend, and of course, I was the unlucky one who had to stay behind. By the time I finished and left the office, it was almost midnight. The city felt different at night. It's quieter, calmer. It's like all the hustle and noise disappear, leaving behind an eerie silence. I made my way to the train station like I always did. I've lived in this city long enough to know its quirks, and one of those quirks was the midnight train. It was never full, mostly empty, with just a few stragglers like me heading home after a long day. It wasn't the most comfortable ride, but it got me where I needed to go. That night, though, something felt off. When I reached the platform, it was deserted. Not just empty of people, but it felt empty of life. The air was thick, and there was this weird stillness that I couldn't shake. Even the usual sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional footsteps, were gone. It was just me and the dimly lit platform. I shrugged it off. It had been a long day, and I was probably just tired, letting my imagination get the best of me. The train rolled into the station, right on time. The doors slid open with a faint hiss, and I stepped inside. The moment I entered, I felt it. The air inside the train was colder, much colder than it should have been. It sent a chill up my spine, and I couldn't explain why. The train looked normal. Dim lighting, the usual hum of the engine, and a few other passengers scattered throughout the car. But something was wrong. I sat down in my usual seat, near the window, and glanced around. There were maybe 4 or 5 other people in the car with me. A couple of them were wearing business clothes, probably heading home from a late shift just like me. One guy was dressed in a hoodie, his face hidden in the shadows. Another was an old woman sitting quietly near the back, clutching a small bag in her lap. But none of them were moving. Not in the usual way people fidget or glance at their phones. They were completely still. No one looked up. No one spoke. It was like they were frozen, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I tried to ignore it. I pulled out my phone, figuring I'd listen to some music to pass the time. But when I checked, there was no signal. That wasn't unusual, though. Sometimes the underground tunnels messed with the reception, so I didn't think much of it. I put my phone back in my pocket and leaned back, trying to relax. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Normally, the next stop would have come by now, but the train kept moving endlessly through the darkness. I looked out the window, hoping to see the familiar lights of the next station, but there was nothing. Just black. No lights, no buildings, no signs of the city at all. It was like we were traveling through a void. A cold wave of unease washed over me. Something wasn't right. I glanced at the other passengers again, hoping to catch someone's eye, But they were all still sitting there, perfectly still, as if they hadn't moved a muscle since I got on. Their faces were blank, emotionless. That's when I noticed something strange about the man sitting across from me. His eyes, they were open, but they didn't look right. At first, I thought he was just tired, his eyes glassy from a long day. But the more I looked, the more I realized there was something terribly wrong. His eyes were hollow, like there was nothing behind them. No life. Just emptiness. I felt my heart start to race. I looked around again, more carefully this time, and saw that all the passengers had the same hollow, dead eyes. They were staring straight ahead, not blinking, not moving. Panic started to creep in. I stood up, trying to stay calm. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking a little. "Does anyone know what's going on? Where's the next stop?" No one answered, not even a glance. It was like they didn't hear me at all. I walked down the aisle, approaching one of the passengers, a young woman sitting with her hands folded in her lap. "Hey," I said, louder this time. "Are you okay?" She didn't move. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. Her eyes were fixed ahead, glassy and lifeless, just like the others. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I made my way to the front of the car, to the door that led to the next carriage. I tried the handle, locked. I pounded on it, calling out, "Hey, is anyone there? What's going on?" No response. Suddenly, the lights in the car flickered. Once, twice, then they went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I stood there frozen, listening to the steady hum of the train, the clattering of the wheels on the tracks. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as my mind raced. What was happening? Where were we? The lights flickered back on, but the train was different now. The passengers were gone. All of them. The seats were empty, as if they had never been there at all. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the car was completely empty. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Still nothing but darkness outside. No buildings, no lights, no signs of life. Just an endless stretch of black, like the world outside had vanished. Then, from somewhere deep within the train, I heard it. A low, raspy whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It echoed through the empty car, sending a chill down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded wrong. Twisted. Like something was speaking in a language I didn't understand, but could feel. The whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right next to me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there, just the empty seats, the dim lights, and the endless hum of the train. The whispers continued, wrapping around me, seeping into my mind, filling me with a deep, overwhelming sense of dread. I had to get off this train. Now. I ran to the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but the only response was the relentless whispering. It felt like the train was alive, like it was pulling me deeper into some dark, twisted nightmare. Then the train screeched to a halt. The force of it threw me to the floor, and for a moment, everything went silent. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked around. The car was still empty, the passengers gone, the whispers silenced. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and I stepped out into the cold night air. But this wasn't my stop. This wasn't any stop I recognized. The station was dark, abandoned, the walls covered in grime and rust. There were no signs, no maps, no indication of where I was. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay, and the only sound was the distant drip of water echoing through the station. I looked back at the train, but it was already pulling away, vanishing into the darkness. I was alone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the black void where the train had disappeared. Minutes? Hours? Time felt strange, like it didn't exist in this place. I looked around, hoping to find some clue, some sign of life, but the station was empty. Completely empty. The only way out was a narrow, dimly lit staircase leading up to the surface. I had no other choice. I took a deep breath and started climbing. As I ascended, the air grew colder. Each step felt heavier, like something was pulling me back, trying to keep me in the darkness. My legs burned, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to the real world. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I realized I wasn't anywhere familiar. Story 5. Everything changed on the night I dared my friends to spend the night in an abandoned graveyard. I thought it would be a fun prank, something to laugh about later. I had no idea that what we were about to awaken would haunt us forever. It started like any other Friday night. Me and my 3 best friends, Jake, Matt, and Sarah, were hanging out at my place, playing video games and eating junk food. We'd been talking about how there was nothing to do in our boring town when Jake brought up the graveyard. "Hey, you know that old cemetery on the edge of town? The one they closed off a few years ago?" Jake said, his eyes lighting up. "I heard it's haunted." "Haunted?" Matt snorted. "Come on, dude, ghosts aren't real." Sarah leaned forward, her face serious. "My grandmother used to say that cemetery was cursed. She said the spirits there are restless because they weren't properly buried." I rolled my eyes. "Cursed, huh? Sounds like a perfect place for a dare." Jake smirked. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we go there tonight," I said, crossing my arms. "Spend the night. Whoever chickens out has to buy the group pizza for a month." It was supposed to be a harmless joke, a way to prove that ghosts didn't exist, and maybe get some free pizza out of it. I never expected anyone to say yes, but to my surprise, everyone agreed. The plan was set. We'd meet at the old cemetery at midnight. None of us told our parents where we were going. We didn't want them to freak out. As the clock struck 12, we grabbed our flashlights, jackets, and a few snacks, and headed out. The cemetery was at the edge of town, hidden behind a rusted iron gate, and surrounded by thick, overgrown trees. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. No one ever went there. The town even tried to block off the entrance with a big "no trespassing" sign, but that didn't stop us. When we arrived, the gate creaked as we pushed it open. A cold wind swept through the trees, making the branches sway and rustle in a way that made my skin crawl. The cemetery itself was even creepier than I had imagined. Old, crumbling tombstones jutted out of the ground at odd angles, and the grass was so tall it nearly swallowed them whole. "Wow, this place is even worse than I thought," Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the chilly air. Jake grinned, clearly trying to hide his nerves. "Well, we're here now. Let's get this over with." The air grew colder, much colder, and the wind picked up, whipping through the trees like it was angry. The laughter died down, and a heavy silence settled over us. I glanced at my friends, and I could tell they felt it too. Something was wrong. "Did you guys hear that?" Matt asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know. It sounded like whispering." We all froze, straining our ears to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind. But then, faintly, I heard it too. A soft, distant whisper, like someone was talking just out of earshot. "Probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. Jake shook his head. "No, man, that's not the wind. That's something else." The whispering grew louder, and it was coming from all around us. It was like the voices were circling us, growing closer by the second. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time that night, I started to feel real fear. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. We all turned to look at her, and she was pointing at one of the gravestones a few feet away. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what she was pointing at. There was a figure standing behind the gravestone. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a person. Or at least, it looked like a person. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, and its face was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight. But the most terrifying part was its eyes. They were hollow, empty, like black pits that stared straight through us. Before any of us could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk, though. It glided as if it wasn't even touching the ground. It moved closer and closer, and that's when I noticed something even more horrifying. There were more of them. Dozens of figures began to emerge from the shadows, all with the same pale faces and hollow eyes. They floated between the tombstones, their whispers growing louder, filling the air with an eerie, chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "We have to get out of here," Jake shouted, his voice shaking with fear. But as we scrambled to our feet, the ground beneath us started to tremble. The earth began to crack, and a foul stench filled the air, like something had crawled out from the depths of the ground. I looked down and saw bony hands clawing their way out of the dirt. Skeletons, their bones cracked and decayed, were pulling themselves out of their graves. Sarah screamed again, and this time, it wasn't just from fear. One of the skeletons had grabbed her ankle, its bony fingers digging into her skin. We rushed to pull her free, but more and more skeletons were emerging, their hollow eye sockets staring at us with a kind of hunger I had never seen before. We were surrounded. Story 6. I had my life together. A good job, a wonderful little boy, and our small but cozy home. As a single mother, my days were filled with love and challenges, but my nights, they became something else entirely. It all started a few weeks ago. I remember the first time my phone rang at exactly midnight. I was in bed, trying to catch up on some sleep after a long day. My son Max was already fast asleep in his room down the hall. The sudden sound startled me, and for a second I wondered who would call at such an odd hour. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, but answered. "Hello?" I whispered, careful not to wake Max. There was no response, just breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. I hung up, thinking it was a prank or a misdial. It bothered me for a bit, but eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next night it happened again. Midnight. Unknown number, and the same breathing on the other end. This continued every night for a week. I didn't tell anyone, mainly because I thought I could handle it, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. Besides, who would believe me? It's just some creep with too much time on their hands, right? But then the whispering started. One night, as I lay there listening to the rhythmic breathing, a voice, low and scratchy, spoke my name. Anna. My heart raced. I sat up, gripping my phone. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. The only response was a soft, almost taunting chuckle, followed by more breathing. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, peeking into Max's room to make sure he was safe. The next day, I blocked the number, feeling some relief. But it didn't last. The following night, at midnight sharp, my phone rang again. It was the same unknown number, even though I had blocked it. How was that even possible? I didn't answer this time. I let it go to voicemail. But the ringing, it continued, as if my phone didn't care that I was ignoring it. It rang for what felt like hours, though it was probably just minutes. Finally, it stopped. I checked my voicemail in the morning, and there it was. The same breathing, followed by the voice whispering again, this time more chilling than before. "I know what you did, Anna." My stomach dropped. What could they possibly know? My mind raced, trying to think of anything that could make sense of this. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt trapped in a waking nightmare. The next few nights, the voice became bolder, revealing things no one else could know. My darkest secrets. Things from my past I had buried deep, things I never even told my closest friends. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if someone was watching me, studying me. One night, the voice whispered something I hadn't thought about in years. Something I had almost convinced myself never happened. "You left him." My breath caught in my throat. No one knew about that. No one. I hadn't told a soul about that night, about the decision I made all those years ago. The voice continued, relentless. "You left him to die, Anna. You never looked back." Tears welled up in my eyes as the memories I had buried so deep resurfaced. I had been young, reckless, and scared. It was a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But how could anyone know? I never told anyone, not even Max's father. I started to feel unsafe in my own home. Every night, the calls came, and every night, the voice revealed more about my past, things I wished I could forget. It felt like someone was pulling the strings of my life, toying with my mind. I went to the police, but what could they do? They brushed it off as a prank, telling me to change my number, which I did. But it didn't matter. The calls kept coming, no matter what I did. One night, I had enough. I answered the phone, my voice trembling with anger and fear. "What do you want from me?" I screamed into the receiver. There was a long pause. Then the voice, calm and deliberate, responded, "I'm already here, Anna, and I'm not leaving." My heart froze. I scanned the room, then rushed to check on Max. He was sound asleep, unaware of the terror unfolding around us. The calls didn't stop after that. In fact, they got worse. I started seeing things. Shadows in the corners of my eyes, doors creaking open when I knew I had closed them. I felt watched, even during the day. And then one night, I heard a knock at the front door. It was soft at first, but insistent. I grabbed my phone and looked at the clock. Midnight. The phone rang again, and this time I didn't answer. I crept towards the door, every muscle in my body tense, expecting the worst. When I peeked through the peephole, no one was there. But then, the voice spoke again, this time from behind me. "I told you, Anna, I'm already here." I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly helpless. That's when I knew this wasn't just a prank. This was something far darker. Something beyond my control. And I don't know how to stop it. I still get the calls every single night at midnight. I can feel it watching me, waiting. And now, as I sit here telling you this, the phone's about to ring again. It's midnight. Story 7. It started about 6 months ago. I had just moved into this cozy little apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was perfect for me. A small, 2-bedroom place with a tiny kitchen and a living room that had just enough space for my couch, TV, and a bookshelf. And importantly, it had an attic. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The landlord had mentioned it during the walkthrough. Just a small storage space. Nothing to worry about. I never even bothered to look inside. I didn't have much stuff anyway, and the idea of crawling up into a dusty attic wasn't appealing. Everything seemed normal for the first few weeks. I settled into my new routine, working from home, watching TV in the evenings, reading a good book before bed. Life was peaceful, almost boring. But then, little things started to happen. At first, I didn't notice them. A glass would be slightly out of place on the counter, or a chair would be pulled out from the table when I knew I had pushed it in. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. I was busy with work, maybe a little stressed. It made sense that I'd forget small things like that. Right? Then, one evening, I came home from a quick trip to the grocery store, and the fridge was wide open. I frowned, thinking back. I hadn't even opened it before I left. Still, I must have done it without thinking. Left it ajar, and it had swung open while I was out. I closed it, shook my head, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. But the more I tried to brush it off, the more things started to happen. One morning, I found my keys in a completely different spot from where I always leave them. I have a hook by the door. It's a habit I've had for years to avoid losing them. But when I went to grab them, they were on the kitchen counter instead. Again, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had absent-mindedly set them down while putting away groceries the day before. A few days later, I woke up to the sound of something thudding softly above me. At first, I thought it was the neighbors, but then I remembered there were no neighbors above me. My apartment was on the top floor. That's when the attic came back to mind. I lay there in bed, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear the noise again. Silence. Maybe it was just an animal. Squirrels or birds sometimes got into attics, right? It didn't mean anything sinister. I tried to convince myself of that, but over the next few nights, the noises continued. Soft footsteps, faint scratching, the occasional thud. I started losing sleep, tossing and turning, my mind racing with possibilities. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I finally decided to check the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously pulled down the creaky old ladder that led up to the dark, musty space above my apartment. The smell hit me first, a damp, moldy odor that made me wrinkle my nose. I shone the flashlight around, half expecting to see something out of a horror movie, a ghost, a monster, something. But the attic looked empty. Just a bunch of old insulation, a few cobwebs, and a couple of cardboard boxes left by previous tenants. I exhaled, relieved, and started to climb back down. But then, just as I was about to close the attic door, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the attic, behind one of the boxes, there was a small pile of stuff. Blankets, a few cans of food, some water bottles. It was like a makeshift camp. And next to it, a book. One of my books. I froze, staring at the scene before me, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Someone had been living up here, in my attic, and they had been in my apartment, touching my things. A cold, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound, and climbed down the ladder as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I closed the attic door, locking it behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside, made my heart race. I kept glancing at the ceiling, half expecting to see someone climbing down from the attic. The next morning, I called the police. They came, searched the attic, and found the same pile of belongings I had. But whoever had been living up there was gone. They told me it was probably a homeless person who had snuck in somehow and assured me that it was unlikely they would come back. Unlikely, but not impossible. I couldn't stay in the apartment after that. Even with new locks and security cameras, I never felt safe. Every little noise made me jump. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. Eventually, I moved out. I found a new place across town, smaller, with no attic. I thought I could leave it all behind, that the fear would go away once I was in a new place. But it didn't. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. I check the locks on my doors a dozen times a day. I glance at the corners of my apartment, convinced I'll see something out of place. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear those soft footsteps above me. But there's no attic here, right? Story 8. I never thought coming back to my dorm after a weekend away would mess with my mind like this. I was just a regular college student, a bit stressed with exams, but nothing too crazy. I'd gone home for the weekend to catch a break, and everything seemed fine when I left on Friday. My roommate Lucy had been sitting at her desk, earphones in, probably zoning out to some podcast or another, the way she always did. I waved goodbye, told her I'd see her Monday morning, and that was it. But when I came back that Monday, something felt off right away. I pushed open the door to our dorm room, and the first thing I noticed was how clean everything was. Too clean. The bed across from mine, Lucy's bed, was made perfectly, but something was missing. Her books, her posters, her little trinkets that cluttered every surface, all gone. I stared at the empty bed, my brain struggling to catch up. At first, I thought maybe she'd moved out over the weekend. But why would she do that without saying anything? We weren't best friends or anything. But we got along fine. We'd been roommates for almost a year. If she was leaving, she would have told me, right? I dropped my bag and called out her name. Lucy? Silence. My stomach twisted as I walked around the room, trying to make sense of it. Her desk was cleared out, not a single notebook or pen left behind. Her closet was empty too. It looked like nobody had ever lived there. That's when the weird stuff started happening. I texted her, of course, but the message didn't go through. It just said, "Number not in service." I checked it again, thinking maybe I'd typed something wrong, but no, it was her number. I'd texted her 100 times before, so why wasn't it working now? I tried calling her next, but all I got was a generic voicemail, the kind you hear when someone's phone is disconnected. This number is no longer in service. The message played on repeat, as if mocking me. Panic started bubbling up in my chest. Maybe she was hurt. Maybe something had happened to her over the weekend. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through my contacts to call some of our mutual friends. But then I froze. Her contact, it wasn't there. Lucy's name, her number, everything. It was gone. I scrolled up and down, but there was no trace of her anywhere. What the hell? I raced out of the dorm and headed straight for the RA's office. My hands were shaking as I banged on the door. "Hey, is Lucy around, my roommate? She's not in our room, and I can't reach her," I said, my voice trembling. The RA, a tall guy named Jason, looked at me like I was crazy. "Lucy?" he asked, eyebrows furrowed. "Who's Lucy?" "My roommate?" I insisted, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "Lucy Hartman. We've been roommates all year." Jason shook his head, a slow, confused smile spreading across his face. "There's no Lucy Hartman in this dorm," he said. "You've had a single room since you moved in." I felt the floor drop out from under me. No, you've got it wrong. I have a roommate. We've shared a room since September. How could you forget?" But he just shrugged, pulling up a list on his computer. He turned the screen toward me, showing me the list of students in the dorm. My name was there, clear as day. But Lucy's? Nowhere to be found. My head was spinning. "That's impossible," I whispered. "She's real. She's been here the whole time. Everyone knows Lucy." Jason gave me this sympathetic look, like he thought I was losing my mind. "You've been alone this whole semester. Maybe you're just tired, stressed out or something. It happens. You should get some rest." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare where no one believed me. My roommate, my friend, was gone, and no one even remembered she existed. I spent the rest of the day asking everyone I knew, but the responses were all the same. "No, I don't think I've met a Lucy Hartman." "Are you sure you're not confusing her with someone else?" Maybe you've just been under a lot of pressure lately. By the end of the day, I was starting to question my own sanity. Could I have imagined her? Was Lucy just some kind of figment of my imagination? That didn't make any sense, though. I remembered her. I remembered her annoying habit of leaving her shoes in the middle of the floor, her late-night giggles when she FaceTimed her boyfriend, her poster of some indie band plastered above her bed. But no matter how hard I tried to prove she was real, the more I started to doubt myself. It was like she'd been erased from the world. No one remembered her, and there was no physical trace of her ever being there. I spent the next few days locked in my room, going over everything in my head, trying to figure out what had happened. But every time I tried to think about Lucy, my memories of her started to blur. Details faded, the sound of her voice, the way she laughed, it all began to slip away like sand through my fingers. And then, one night, something even stranger happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the door creaking open. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat up, my eyes darting to the door. It was open, just a crack. I hadn't opened it. "Lucy?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No answer. I got out of bed slowly, my bare feet cold on the floor. I tiptoed to the door and peeked out into the hallway. It was empty, quiet, just the dim, flickering light of the dorm's hallway lamps. But something felt wrong. Like there was something just out of sight. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me, and backed away. My mind was racing. Was Lucy trying to come back? Or was something else happening here? Something I couldn't explain. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, I heard it again, a soft, rustling sound, like the sound of someone moving around in the dark. My eyes shot open, and I nearly screamed. The closet door was open. I know I had closed it earlier, and there, standing just inside the closet, was a figure. Tall, shadowy, and just out of the reach of the dim light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me.